Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Thank you for sticking with us. It's not only the last session, it's lunchtime, and it's about 75 degrees outside, I think. So we really appreciate you all being in here. And now they're going to lock the doors. No, I'm kidding. All right, so you guys have been listening to a lot of discussion over the last couple of days around lots of different elements of compliance, all the way from hotline, whistleblower, third-party risks, cyber security issues, and so forth, so lots of scary topics. But the topic of our discussion today is much more focused on the role of the board in the compliance world, the board of directors, and how the board of directors works with the chief compliance officer and can help and support the chief compliance officer in their mission and what they're trying to accomplish. So we have two terrific, very distinguished directors with us to help. We have Sam DiPiazza, who's a director for JLL and AT&T. We have Patricia Dennis, who's a director at U.S. Steel. We have Richard Bushband, who is the general counsel at the ManpowerGroup, and then Daniel Trujillo, who's our chief compliance officer at Walmart. So we've got the whole spectrum, I think, covered, and we are ready to get into it. So I thought I would start first with a quote from Mary Jo White, who's the chair of the SEC, and she's recently quoted on the topic of tone at the top. So she says that ensuring the right tone at the top for a company is a critical responsibility for each director and the board collectively. Setting the standard in the boardroom that good corporate governance and rigorous compliance are essential goes a long way in engendering a strong corporate culture throughout an organization. How directors can most effectively instill a strong corporate culture and how challenging it is to do so will vary from company to company. So hopefully we're going to get a few tips here on tone at the top and how you can have a significant impact over that and how you feel the role of the board is in that environment. So I don't know, Sam, maybe I'll turn to you to kind of start with some thoughts there.
Well, tone at the top, the behavior of the senior executive group, how they deal with tough issues, obviously is top of mind of every board that either you interact with or that you serve on. I would say you start by understanding the stated culture of the organization, but as a board member, that's just the entry card. Then it becomes a process over time of understanding how the senior executives deal with issues as they progress. It's not about the words, because everyone has the code of conduct, the ethics statements, all the things. It's what do they do? What are their practices? How do they deal with the exceptions? And for boards, it's a learning process, and it's a process you do with management, but it is one of those things where you learn the difference between oversight and management. It's your job to understand the issues well enough, to understand what the words are supposed to mean, and then to work with management as they implement that over a period of time. I've been in both places. I've seen great companies with great cultures, great tone at the top, and I've seen companies that had all the right words, but when you watched them behave, everything was at a 75% achievement. And in those companies, you have to decide why you're there. Are you there to help? Or are they just playing off your reputation as a board member? Are they using your advice? And it is, Paula, the critical issue that a board member has to deal with.
Yep.
Well, I agree it's critical, but I actually think no board member on any board, anywhere, can really know the culture of a company. You just can't. You come in 5-6 times a year, and I don't think it is possible to know what are in the hearts and minds of those, really not just at the top, but throughout the culture. Tone at the top is extremely critical, but I think it's really important to ensure that culture, the tone that is set by the top, is all the way down to mid-level management. That's the tough nut to crack, I think. So there's some things that I have learned the hard way because I've been on a number of boards before I came to U.S. Steel. And the first thing, of course, is you hire a top-rate chief compliance officer, and Suzanne Folsom, who hired Rob Gerritsen, is here today, and I want to say that's the first step, number one. But I think you make the hiring, because we're responsible for the hiring and the firing of the CEO, and he or she often checks with us on other hiring and firing, and you make sure that ethics and integrity, character, the right stuff is embodied in everybody who's hiring or firing you oversee, that you know that you're firing somebody because they don't have the right stuff. So you've got to get involved in ensuring that ethics and integrity is on the table, that it matters, and it's one of the criteria that you judge people for, not just their past experience or where they went to school and that kind of thing. In succession planning, we also put integrity and ethics on the table. We have an extraordinary system of succession planning. I'm also on the board of Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company. I've been on that board 20 years. Ugh, I know term limits are a big thing now, so I'm going off. But it is, we've been consistent. I'm newer to U.S. Steel, but we have consistently done an extraordinary job of succession planning, and we needed it. So we do make ethics, character, again, those qualities part of the succession planning process as we review those folks, not just for the executive leadership team, but the levels below them as well. Really critical, too, is the board response when a matter of integrity surfaces. When you find out that someone's done something that's unethical or, fraudulent. What did the board do about it? Did we discuss it? Did we take it seriously? Or did we turn a blind eye? Because the employees are going to know. They're going to know whether it mattered to the board. They find out. Tough ones. The CFO arrested for a DWI. How much does that really matter to him or her doing their job? We've had that situation. You need an honest and open discussion and grapple with that as a board. So the NFL, they care a lot today about spousal abuse. Now, it's an issue that Americans care about. People have gotten in trouble because they didn't pay much attention to it. So, it's that kind of judgment and understanding that board members need to bring to bear when dealing with, I think, because you're going to have a credibility issue if you're dealing with tone at the top and you don't treat it as seriously as you should. So what I also have learned to do is to get to know employees so I can really get into the culture, the day-to-day culture. So I speak to employee groups at the companies where I sit on the boards. I've gotten to know people on the Latino employee group, the African American, the LBGT, you name it, so that they will feel comfortable and trust me that I have their best interest at heart. And if you have a CEO who does not allow members of the company, whether it's the executive leadership team on down, to talk to board members offline, you got a problem. You got a real problem. And I think finally, a CEO who believes in a meritocracy, really important. I've worked in 3 companies, and I think meritocracy is a real difficult thing to achieve, especially the older the company, the less likely it is to exist. So really fortunate if you have a CEO who believes in merit to advance people, because that also then will dilute the ability of people to engage in unethical practices.
Right.
So, sorry, a long-winded answer, but years of experience, obviously.
Yeah. No, I think very, very helpful. I interact with a lot of boards, and I think that this is a real issue for them, trying to figure out how to get underneath this and really get comfortable. And I think your concept of meeting with different individuals, even in different global locations and so forth, so that you can really, look in their eyes and understand how they feel about the company, how they feel about its culture.
And they have to not be frightened, right,
to
do it, because I know that a lot of folks, when I was in government, and I was on the Federal Communications Commission, and we'd be at broadcasting conferences, and the broadcasters would come over and they would hide their names. Not too comforting that they didn't want you to know them. So there's that tendency, I think, in some cultures to shoot messengers and not want to give any bad news. So I think that's a way to undercut that.
And how can, Daniel, I'll turn to you. How can the Chief Compliance Officer help the board get comfortable, help them interact with people if that's an element of it?
That's a good question. So first, let me refer a little bit to something that you were saying, because I've seen it from the other side. I mean, I present to the board, to the audit committee. I did it in previous jobs as well. And I have to say, I have two short stories that to me are very relevant for what we do. It was back in 2013 after presenting the plan of the enhancement of our program to the audit committee. I have one of the board members that took me out at the end. I mean, and he just grabbed me and he said, look, I want to be sure that you understand that if things don't go the way you are planning to make them happen, you can call me directly. I mean, you have my full support. So how relevant that was, I mean, we are now 4 years into this, and how relevant that is, how much that means to a team, to a leader in compliance, that you are putting together a program and you are asking the company to be spending a significant amount of money and resources and time and effort. And that's one. And the other one, which it's probably a little bit funny, but true, I was back last year in our shareholders meeting. Our CEO was on stage, it was public, it was in YouTube. We have a big relevant shareholders meeting. And he started talking about compliance. And he said really very strong messages. And I was there, and I remember that when the shareholders meeting finished, a lot of people approached me and they said, hey, you did a great job. I mean, preparing the CEO to say that. I said, I wish I could take any credit. I didn't talk to him about that.
Great CEO to have.
How relevant it is for us, for what we are doing, what we are asking them to spend the money and put the effort that they believe in it.
Well, getting the opportunity to either help or encourage the executives to put compliance on the agenda, right, on the topic list for big meetings and stuff, so that they have an opportunity to speak to the masses about that topic is really a great way to see it actually go in action. Richard, you've got something to add.
I have several things I'd like to comment on. Let me go back to what Patricia was saying about tone at the top. I think one of the most important things a board can do is be very clear with its management team what the board's expectations are. And that might seem a bit simplistic, but I'm not sure there's always that direct communication so that the executive team who's charged with operating the company day to day truly understands what the board's expectations are. And not in the companies I've worked with, but in others that we read about, we sometimes see the evidence that maybe the board was very happy with an ethics and compliance program so long as it didn't interfere with earnings per share or a financial metric or shareholder value or something like that. So this ripples through a lot of the work that the board does, whether it's as a full board or a compensation committee. Compensation committee sets incentives for the executive team, most notably for the CEO. Look, we all know that people will behave in the way that they're incented to behave. If it's important for a board, then that can become, perhaps should become, part of the overall compensation discussion, maybe even some metrics around it. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things the board can do is make sure that expectations are well understood, they're visible, they're transparent, so that there are no surprises. If I can continue for a moment, there is a division between what a board does and what a management team does. Yes, of course, they have to work very closely together. Directors have a fiduciary duty under state law, at least for U.S. companies, similar for most overseas jurisdictions. The management team executes as directed by the board. Now, that doesn't mean everything needs to wait for direction or guidance from the board, but there is a division of labor, and there should be a boundary between the two. One of the directors on my company has said that her viewpoint is the board vis-a-vis the management should be noses in and fingers out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a line you hear a lot. Sam?
This question of how the board gets a sense of what's happening inside the company. Patricia referenced it, Daniel did too. A lot of it is the interaction between the board and the senior executives. But it's not, this question of compliance, of ethics, of behavior, if the board is doing its job, it is looking far beyond the compliance group, far beyond the general counsel, looking for the signals from every operating officer, from the human capital organization, from the people survey. The board is weaving that mosaic together to get a sense of what's happening deep in the roots. In my view, one of the first things that I want to see is compliance part of the strategy, or is it imposed? If it's imposed, you're going to have a problem, because people are going to, as Rich said, they're going to meet their expectations. They're going to try to push the envelope. If it's part of the strategy, and if your compliance team sits at the table during the dialogue of the strategy, and if you hear the operating officers refer to their boundaries, what they'll allow and what they won't allow, you get a much better sense of it. And the board is watching and learning. I agree with Patricia that culture is hard to feel, but I don't exactly agree that, because over time, the board has to understand what's going on deep in an organization. They have to understand the culture. And they have to begin to influence through their choice of the CEO and others. Is that culture reflective of what they think the company and its heritage stands for? So I know both of these companies, Manpower and Walmart. We were talking about, Daniel was at Schlumberger before, extraordinary focus on ethics and behavior, but not perfect. They make mistakes. And the board has to be knowledgeable enough that it can react to those mistakes and how management deals with them over time.
You have a great point. One of the things that we talk a lot to the board is that we want compliance by design, and we want from compliance to commitment. We want to be sure that there is a commitment that goes beyond our own organization of compliance and what we are doing with we have 2.2 million employees or associates, so it's impossible to expect that they will all have exactly the same level of education, of preparation, and understanding. We have to reach all of them, but that's what we say, that it's from compliance to commitment. We need to be sure that everybody's committed with doing the right thing.
And how many countries do you...
Yeah.
We're in 28 countries.
Yeah.
And Manpower?
80.
Yeah.
And those have different cultures, different standards. I was with a senior executive the other day from Siemens, and we were reflecting on what Siemens went through in the last decade. And I knew Siemens very well. I knew the CEO very well, the former CEO. I knew the COO very well, the former COO. These were good people.
Yeah.
And in their world, they thought this was okay. And it wasn't. And they paid a heavy price for their problem. So I think you have to understand that multicultural environment. And the board, whether you're American or not, you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of those managers and make sure that the culture and the controls and the compliance of the organization takes you where you want to go.
So Sam, let me make a comment, and I think it's something that raises the burden, the expectation of people on the leadership team. If you look at how boards are composed today, and you look at the influence that shareholder groups have had, and the stock exchanges and the independence rules, it used to be that directors would remain on a board sometimes forever, often for too long, and there are a lot of issues with that. It also used to be the case that typically 2, maybe even 3 executives from the company would be on the board, and that's a rare thing. Typically today it's only the CEO, occasionally a CFO or another executive. And there's pressure for term limits, and there's pressure to refresh boards. And these are all good things individually, but if you take them all together, you end up with a boardroom where there's some rotation in and out, and it's fairly rapid. Typical tenure for an S&P 500 director maybe is 7 years today, and once they're at 10 or 12 years, there's pressure to cycle off. In the United Kingdom, there's a presumption for companies that are governed by their rules that a director is no longer independent after 9 years. So how do you, and I think the burden's on us in leadership, how do you instill a culture? How do you get directors comfortable in their knowledge of the company and do so when there are 5 or 6 meetings a year and they might be on that board for 6 or 8 years and not longer than that?
Yeah. And directors spend, just for the record, about 250 hours a year working with that company, and they're probably on several boards, right? So they're busy people, and in that 250 hours, they have to deal with all the issues, big company issues that they're working through, as well as get a handle on the culture, right? That's so.
Well,
it is
there's
just
certain
that,
issues but there's certain issues that cut across every industry, right? So that you're not relearning those, and frankly, I think your points are ones that say that's why you need diversity. And I'm not talking the tried and true, race, ethnicity stuff. I'm talking about people with very different experiences. I have found that boards get in trouble when there's a lot of similarity in the good old buddies. Because I went on a board in the early 90s when there was no Sarbanes, and it was the buddy system, and it was the buddy of the CEO, and they all played golf together. And I mean, my very first board meeting, I'll never forget that I was the only woman, the only non-white person, and sitting there, they started talking about how big their yachts were, and I thought, which one of these is not like the other?
Yeah.
So and boardrooms have their own cultures, and some of them are welcoming, and some of them are not. So I think part of the answer, and I recognize, and it's interesting, I don't know what the exact statistic is for what percentage today of boards have members who are longer serving. We've just adopted a new rule.
But some of them still have large boats, because I've heard that conversation.
But I do think that if you have a diverse enough team, you're going to weather the changes and still do what you're supposed to do and do it well. I do believe that.
But I agree with Patricia, and to be explicit, a board member, I think, it takes them at least 2 years
to get up to speed.
To get up to speed and understand not only the business complexities, the geographic issues, the business model, get to know the management, but then to get a deep insight into the cultural demands and the risk and the opportunities. And I've seen it both models. I mean, at the Mayo Clinic, where I chair the board, this year, we rotated off Ron Olson, who is a named partner at Munger, Tolles & Olson, one of the most outstanding lawyers in the world, and Tom Brokaw. It broke our hearts, but we have a 12-year limitation on our board, and this is a very strategic, highly regulated industry, and Mayo Clinic is the best in that space. And so we stayed true to the issue, but tell me it didn't break my heart to see Ron and Tom rotate off.
But Sam, I think there's something that we can do, and as I look at the audience, I'm presuming that most of the people in the room are management rather than directors. If that's the case, there's a role we can play in helping those new directors get up to speed. It's something we do. I could probably do it better at my company. We have a new director join. There should be an onboarding process. There should be an educational process. And usually there is, but this is our first opportunity to make sure if there's key messaging around compliance, around ethics, around anything else, that we're getting in front of that director, emphasizing that part of the culture as they're joining the board.
And it goes beyond, it goes beyond that. I think that it goes as well when you are having each presentation to the board, just ensuring that you are using those precious minutes that you have with them on talking about things that are going to be relevant for them and are going to help them to get a better understanding of what is being done, why it's being done, and where are we going as well, right? Not only on the welcoming of the board member, but afterwards when the board member is already established.
Yeah. So let's get a little bit deeper into the board's role in oversight, right? So for the boards that you interact with, the four of you, who's like the point person that has oversight of compliance, of the chief compliance function? Is it a committee, a subcommittee, like the audit committee, or is it the full board, or how does that work?
In our case, it's the audit committee mostly. Okay. We have also the CNGC, And in some cases, the CNGC participates in some topics, the Compensation and Nominating Governance Committee as well. But it's mostly the Audit Committee.
Primarily been delegated to the Audit Committee?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Very similar at ManpowerGroup, primarily Audit Committee, Nominating and Governance Committee to some degree. But I would add in as a strategic suggestion, committee members are not all created equally. Sometimes the right person for the relationship to be built with is the chairman of the committee, but it doesn't even have to be that. I'd encourage finding a couple of committee members where there's a strong relationship who can serve as your sponsor, not to the exclusion of the others, but sometimes you just need a mechanism to get on the agenda.
Board member champion, or if you will.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, champion to serve that role.
You know, I would just, audit committee is by far the most frequent place, but compliance and conduct and ethics is pervasive and throughout a company, and so my view is, where is the risk? If the risk is in the quality space, at Mayo, it's about patient safety and privacy. Those aren't necessarily audit committee questions. The audit committee may own the umbrella of the process,
right?
But the compliance effort, which is again spread throughout the management team, has to find its way inside multiple committees, including compensation, and then the board as a whole. Any issue of any substance has to find itself to the table of the board. If not, then you're just making it a mechanical process.
So how do we do that, Sam? Because my experience with boards, and I'll admit it describes my current board and every other one I've worked with, there is so much on their plate, and particularly if it's limited to the hours 5 or 6 times a year that they spend together in formal board session. And I always have the feeling that it's an effort to cram 10 pounds worth of sand into a 5-pound bag. How do we get everything onto the agenda? And, we've 20 minutes for this, 15 minutes for that. How do we solve that problem?
A lot of this will go through the personality and direction of the chair. If the chair and the CEO are the same person, I think it's more challenging. Frankly, because the CEO by nature is probably more focused on operational and strategic issues. The chair may be more focused on a broader governance platform, but that's maybe a generalization. If what the board hears is the quarterly ethics report, that's not that helpful. Put it in the minutes, tell them to read it. But if we've got an issue in India, or if we have an issue in Kansas, and it's enough to get the CEO's attention, then the board ought to hear about it. Even if all they hear is a 5-minute vignette, that's what we've got, that's what we're going to do, we'll let you know what happens. And when it doesn't get to that level, if 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters later, it mushrooms, you're going to have a pretty pissed off board. And so if I'm running the meeting, I want to make sure they at least know we've got this issue out there. And frankly, the board then needs to be managed, because you don't need the board to spend 45 minutes on it, but they need to know about it.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I think is also a good practice here is to get additional information into the board book, so that here's some things we're anticipating. We're not going to go into them today, but if it might spark also, that sponsor that you want to get more involved, to pick up the phone. I do that and call and say, what the heck's this about, right? Yeah. And I think that is a good mechanism to ensure that you get enough focus. And frankly, a good board is going to take extra time if there's something that's really burning.
So Daniel, because I know you have to run.
Thank you for having me.
So just quick thought. Wait, no, you're still on the hot seat here. Quick thought from you before you go. How do you make sure you get your hot topics on the agenda? How do you get on the agenda?
Tell you the truth, we always have a space, we always have the time, and we always have private sessions as well with them. Yeah. And in our case, there is a lot of work that is being done as well between board meetings. We have different conversations and calls with the head of the audit committee or with all the members of the audit committee in which we prepare, and we normally tell them what we are planning to present as well in the next one, and they know what are the things that we are going to be doing during the year. The truth is that as well, we try to be sure that every time that we have a meeting with them, they know the things that are going on at that very moment. So there is a lot of planning, but there is as well some parts and pieces that go to what is going on today. And again, a lot of work happening in between those meetings. It's not only those meetings, it's a lot of calls and meetings.
Yeah.
And I assume you rely on the judgment of the audit committee chair too about, hey, we maybe
It gets back
should,
to the chair.
Oh, yes.
It gets back to the
It
chair,
gets
as Sam
chair.
said.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is what is so relevant when you have a chair that understands and cares, but understanding as well.
Yeah.
Being able to ask the right questions.
Exactly.
And to look at the information that you are presenting to them and have meaningful comments as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So-
No, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah,
Bye.
take care. Daniel raised an interesting point that we hadn't talked about, but when you think about, so you have an opportunity to present, the chief compliance officer should be presenting to the audit committee or whoever has the direct oversight on a fairly regular basis. Hopefully they're on the agenda and so forth. He brought up private sessions. Is that a common practice? Richard, do you see that where the
Yes.
chief compliance officer gets an opportunity to have a private session after the
Absolutely.
meeting? And what kinds of things do you bring up in that? That's kind of a special moment, right?
Well, it's private. Yeah.
That's your opportunity to say whatever you want to say.
I don't know if I can tell you it's private.
Yeah, but what kinds of things would you say?
It is an audience that I have privately with the audit committee. Now, that's on a formal process, the 5 times a year or so that they meet. And it may be as simple as an update on something. It may also be a concern I have. And, the minutes just say that the private session occurred. I'll point out that while the external auditor is present for most of the audit committee, this is a session in which they are typically not present, or I might ask them to leave for reasons of attorney-client privilege. I don't want to destroy that privilege by having them in the room. And so really, it's my time, to the extent I need it, with the audit committee. But it can also be supplemented with phone calls to the chair. This is just a convenient way to get them all there.
I think one of the obligations of a board, being on committees, and especially the audit committee, where you do get the chief compliance officer updates every board meeting, or at least on all the boards I serve, we do that, is to ask if they have appropriate resources. Really important to ensure that they're getting the corporate support that they need to do their job and do their job well.
And a tricky thing to respond to, I would imagine, on your end, Richard, when somebody asks you that question, right?
I never have enough resources.
See, that's why the tricky thing is, right to the extent of, no, I need your help to get me more resources, and it's a fine line, I would assume, of when you want to go down that road, correct?
I mean, I have found that the audit committees I've worked with have been generous with resources when additional resources are required. More typically, it might be a direction from them about what to focus on, keep going. Don't worry about whose toes you step on. If it's one of those situations,
the support, they're giving you support.
It's support, and
yes.
sometimes it's financial resources that are required, but sometimes you need the backing of the board, right? Because almost by definition, if there is a high-level problem, and I'm speaking in the hypothetical here, it usually will involve some officers of the company. These things didn't arise all by themselves, right? It's somebody's decisions or actions or conduct that put the company either in a difficult position or in a potentially vulnerable one, right? So sometimes you need the support of the board because what follows may not always be comfortable.
Yeah.
Paula, your first question about how often, it is regularly the case in my experience. Maybe not at every meeting, but multiple times during the course of the year. And in that private session, besides the things that you're just trying to give the opportunity for a confidential exchange, the boards that are most effective are the ones that understand the business well enough and the risk and in a very quiet but confidential way are looking for where the stress points are. Where is the business? Where do you feel the business leaning to the left or to the right, off the rails? Where's our stress? What part of the world are we seeing more issues and why? And oftentimes a compliance leader is taken back from that because they prefer to go down the checklist. These are the things we cover. These are the 19 things that you've given us scope on, and this is what we found. Well, we can read that in a PowerPoint.
Right.
What we want to understand at the board is, do we have an issue out there that we need to at least become sensitive to? And you need that dialogue and that trust. And of course, then the board's obligation from that is to protect that confidence.
Yep.
And use it in a smart way. And if you don't have that relationship, you have a bit of an issue. But if you don't put that agenda in place, you're not going to have that dialogue, and then the board will be surprised and wonder why.
Yeah.
And it will be obvious.
Sam, you mentioned PowerPoints, and it prompts an observation on my part. And when the SEC staff presents at a conference, there's this disclaimer they always say that the views are their own and don't represent the institution. So I'm doing one of those. So these are my own personal views, not my company's. I see a lot of PowerPoints prepared for board members, and they are just inundated with data. Okay, the PowerPoints, they're lovely. They're graphical. They have charts. They have multiple colors. They have dashboards. Dashboards are very popular, and there's all this stuff. And my view is that sometimes there's so much stuff it's hard for the audience, for the directors, to extract out of that what really is the message. What is management trying to tell me? What are they concerned about? Is there a conclusion here? Is there an area that requires additional focus, or is it just more dashboard reporting quarter after quarter?
Yeah.
And I think that, I'm as prone to this as anybody else. If I'm working on presentation materials to the board, particularly if I'm not going to get a lot of time to walk through them, I want to make sure my message is clear. What am I telling them is important to understand or to focus on or to be concerned about?
And that's why you do bare bones. I mean,
right.
Yeah, you do a bare bones, and then talk. We have now on all my boards, what we do is, number one, we are reminded of what the strategy is each and every meeting. We have a one-sheeter, and this is our strategy, and then you discuss every issue, whatever committee it is. How does this advance the strategy? And then you do a very bare bones PowerPoint, because I do think it's death by PowerPoint. And if you want more, we have a section in the board book that's got lots of reading that you don't necessarily have to read. It's helpful, but you don't necessarily to make a decision.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, there's a limited amount of time that I think a chief compliance officer gets to present to the board, right? So you want to make sure you don't give them 45 pages, and then when you get there, there could be anything to add at that point, right? You presumably have said everything. So you want to be very, you want to have your elevator pitch that you're going to present, crisp, thought out, know what it is.
Well, that's right. And last quarter we got 15 calls on the hotline, and this quarter we got 12. And my reaction is, so what? Yeah.
But tell me
But I've
something.
seen those graphs.
No, exactly. We had a question, so please. Here we go, a runner right here up in front.
Thank you very much. It's very, very helpful. You've been talking about the hot button issues to make sure that the board's aware of that. But it would be helpful to hear what the board finds as helpful in those quarterly reports you said may not be, but what measurements and what specific substantive type of information you really find helpful. Thank you.
Do you want to start?
I think there are certain things that are just standard on the agenda. The board needs to be aware of conflict of interest issues, hotline issues, those kinds of things, most of which can be assumed read. If there is an elevated risk or senior officer risk, you might have to bring it to the focus. I think that what the board is really looking for is the emerging risk, the difficult territories, either products or territories, and relying on the compliance function, which is just one of them, but a major one of them, to give them signals about issues as they emerge.
Right.
And that's not once a year when you come in and lay out your plan. That's every quarter. I'll give you one for DirecTV. I was on the board of DirecTV before it was acquired by AT&T. One of the issues that the industry relies on is how many new subscribers you have every month, every quarter. And there were little bitty numbers. 100,000 new subscribers was a big number in an organization that had 20 million subscribers. It wasn't material, 100,000. But the board figured out pretty easily that number moved the market, that our investors cared about that number. And we made it a compliance and internal audit review to understand who was fooling around with that number. And ultimately, we found a Latin American country that was fooling around with that number. And a lot of people paid with that with their jobs. But if it wasn't the dialogue that we were having with the compliance leader and the internal audit leader about how that number was being developed, we saw the risk, they had the knowledge, we had the dialogue, and we kept pushing. And ultimately, we saw the problem really before senior management would have picked it out, because they were comfortable with a distributed process because it was immaterial. It wasn't immaterial to the board because it was driving the market.
I think it's a little bit industry dependent, because some industries are much more heavily regulated, although all companies are regulated in lots of different ways now. But I do think one of the things that matters in a heavily regulated industry are what the regulators are doing, and you want to anticipate where the regulators are going, not just what they're doing. And so I personally, having been in regulatory agencies, care, and that's, again, you bring in different kinds of expertise. It's particularly important to me, and it doesn't have to be in the meeting necessarily either, but kind of what are we anticipating? Because it can mean huge changes for the company if particular regulations get into effect. I mean, I'm sure during the acquisition or the DirecTV AT&T merger, there were routine updates on how it was going at the regulatory agencies. The DOJ, especially since AT&T's purchase of T-Mobile did not go so well.
Yeah, it was pretty important to AT&T to get this deal done.
Yeah. So, and to the shareholders for the breakup fee. So I think that it's industry dependent somewhat. In the rating agencies and an insurance company, the rating agencies. Ratings are really important. We've met as a board with the rating agencies. So it depends on what really is kind of the bet the farm kind of issues that the company's facing at that particular year. Yeah. There are always going to be bet the farm kinds of issues that you just need to know about as a board member.
And just two other quick issues. I said earlier that making sure compliance was an integrated function with strategy was really critical. If the compliance organization is taking its steer from the CFO and from others and not involved frontline with strategy, well, a good board will ask that question.
Yeah.
Our strategy is doing X, Y, or Z. How do you react? If the compliance officer says, well, I don't know, I got to go back and look at the strategy document to make sure I know what we ought to be doing. Wrong answer. And then the other one is, what does compliance entail? What is it? What is it in compliance? It's clearly the legal and regulatory and those kinds of issues. But there are a lot of issues that are important to a company, strategically important, that require compliance that are not legal. At an institution I was involved in, it was very important that all succession processes include women and people of color. Uh-huh. And we made it a compliance function to make sure that it was actually happening. And boy, did that shake up a few folks. Uh-huh. But it was so important to us, it was a compliance issue, not a legal or regulatory issue, but a strategic issue for the company.
And this whole concept of ethics and morality, and I've got to say the thing that is troubling to me is our culture in general, American culture. When you think of this culture of celebrity, it is very toxic to raising people with the right moral stuff. And I got very active in Girl Scouts. I am a Girl Scout. Once a Girl Scout, always a Girl Scout. And I chaired the Girl Scouts of the USA because it is an organization that, and Boy Scouts, other youth-serving organizations, build people who become good citizens and good people. And part of our problem right now is that we've got very bad things out there, Kardashian this and reality show that, and it is, we as companies, and being on the boards of directors are also moving against all of that. And so it's a very difficult time in our country, I think, because you would think that anybody who comes to work especially in a high level, is going to be honest and morally correct and tell the truth, and people can speak truth to power. A really dangerous thing in a company is when people cannot speak truth to power. They don't get promoted. It's career threatening. I've lived in those cultures. Those are deadly for creating the right environment for ethics and a good culture to thrive. But our whole society at large. So, it's especially tough.
It's very
time.
challenging. I agree with that. So questions, more questions, terrific.
You can just speak loud. I wondered if the panel could talk about internal investigations. And then specifically, you can talk about whatever you want, but
the board's role in an investigation?
Yeah, and speaking hypothetically.
Yep.
So an ethical issue comes up, and it involves the top management, so the chief compliance officer cannot investigate people above him or her.
Get a great outside lawyer.
Goes to the audit committee, they hire
outside
counsel to do an internal investigation, and my specific question is, once that investigation is done, who gets to hear the results? Does that include the chief compliance officer or not? And then the employees, because a lot of times internal investigations, so the employees see it's going on, they're interviewed, and do they get to hear the results? And it's about the top senior management.
Wow.
Very interesting question. I don't know, Richard, as a general counsel, we might want to start with you because you've got probably a legal side of some of that.
I'll give it a shot. Thankfully, I'm not a veteran of many internal investigations, and I do hope to keep it that way. I think oftentimes the general counsel might be apprised of the results of the investigation or play a role in it. Possibly less frequently would it be the chief compliance officer if those are different people. And I think it just goes to the legal role versus the compliance role. It might well be the case that the GC is not a part of the process, and nor is anybody else in management. I think these things, these investigations, are somewhat sui generis. They depend on the details, the situation at hand, and the board, hopefully in consultation with smart, experienced outside counsel who can assist the board, makes that determination on how to handle that one. I don't think there's a single playbook for internal investigations.
And I 100% agree with that. And the transparency that your question suggests is really a hard judgment call. And I've been on both sides of these, from a PwC perspective where we were doing investigations to companies that had to manage investigations and boards that had to actually conduct them. And your instinct is probably not always helpful because you'd like to be transparent. You'd like to clear the air. And an investigation by its nature involves the name of a person and an action, and you better make sure you get it right, and you better be sure that however it plays out, that you're fair on the backside of that, which may mean termination of the employee or executive. So it's a really hard question, but this is when boards, this is when you can tell if a board has found the sweet spot that Patricia talked about earlier. And unfortunately, a lot of times they haven't, and they're stumbling through it. But the good boards, you'll see it. You'll see it exactly when it's happening. They know how to manage this thing.
And I think the best advice I can give is that the outside counsel should be somebody incredible just really straight up outstanding, and I unfortunately have been on a couple of investigations, and the committee that reviewed the results of the investigation, but what we gave in writing to the outside counsel was, we let the chips fall where they may, you have to thoroughly investigate, et cetera, so that the board felt comfortable with the end result. But again, I would rely personally on the counsel of the outside counsel on with whom do we divulge this, what has been the past practice, if any, at that company, what kind. So you get advice and counsel on how to do it.
Now, having said that, not every internal investigation, in my view, requires outside counsel.
That's true that way.
But she set up
she did.
Yeah,
she did. But I don't want to give the impression. I mean,
No.
there's some smaller ones that I might handle with assistance of other people in management,
Right.
and I think that's fine. In the right
I think
circumstances.
and one of the big things too, if you do go outside, you do decide you have to go to outside counsel, it's really important to go to independent outside counsel,
100%.
right?
Absolutely.
Not outside counsel that's getting paid by the company for other purposes, and so they're not
100%.
independent. So that's
And somebody of
a critical thing.
stature.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, we're at the end of our time, so probably not even enough time. Do you have some comment you want to make? We have some closing comments.
That opened my eyes. I went to a NACD conference in Austin at UT, and they had two psychiatrists talking about how the brain functioned. And one thing that has always been denigrated in the boardroom is a decision that's not data-driven, and that, that's a gut feeling, and you shouldn't, we need to have data-driven decisions and not gut decisions. And these psychiatrists said, and I'm sharing this because it just was a revelation to me, because every time I think somebody's a little wacky or weird, it turns out they are wacky or weird. So, I kind of trust my gut on people. And these psychiatrists said that it is and they told us, and I can't be more articulate about this, I apologize, but you can go online and probably find this. They told us how the brain actually functioned and what it is doing when you get a feeling in your stomach, in your gut. It is retrieving all the data of all your life experiences so that you have a reaction based on data. It is based on data that your brain has worked through. So their takeaway was board decisions. It was about how boards can make better decisions. That they should not only be based on data, but your gut should feel good at the same time. Both things, both criteria. And I think emotional intelligence is really critical for board members.
Yeah, great.
So that's just mine.
Really helpful. Okay, all right, thank you everybody,
All right.
really appreciate it.